Yes.
Thank you. So before I start the second presentation for today, looking at early look-back processes, one question which arose earlier in Ms Scott's presentation was about plasma from Northern Ireland and when that was processed by PFC in Scotland. That was something that was picked up in the Belfast Haemophilia Centre presentation. The official request for it to be dealt with by PFC rather than BPL was in May 1981, and it was expected at that point that the first plasma would reach PFC in October 81. And all the referencing for that point can be found on the website in the Belfast presentation.
Thank you.
So the second presentation for today, as I've said, is looking at early look-back processes. Perhaps it's worth starting by explaining that the purpose of this presentation is twofold. Firstly, it's to put a selection of the documents that the inquiry's identified into the public domain for those who've not had access to the full set of documents that's been provided to the core participants. But secondly, it's to set the scene and to provide the backdrop for subsequent witness evidence. This presentation seeks to set out what had been done previously in relation to look-back processes, albeit often informally, so that we can then explore in much more detail with the relevant witnesses what happened with the Hepatitis C look-back process. Before I start the substance of the presentation, it's worth just dealing with one point of terminology. In the presentation, I'll be talking about both look-back and reverse look-back. Look-back, or sometimes called targeted look-back, is where a donor is identified as being positive for, say, hepatitis B or HTLV3, and the recipients of any transfusions are then traced. Reverse look-back is where a recipient of a blood transfusion or tests positive or was identified as suffering from jaundice in the early days, and the donor is then traced. Both of those processes form part of this presentation. I'm going to address three points in the presentation. The first thing we will look at through the documentation is matters we've identified dealing with early jaundice inquiries, the investigations that were undertaken and the extent of the tracing of donors that took place when jaundice was suffered by a recipient of a blood transfusion. Secondly, we will look at hepatitis B look-back processes, and thirdly, we will look at the HTLV3 look-back process. So starting off then with early jaundice inquiries, we've been unable to identify a precise date when there was a requirement on regional transfusion officers to report cases of post-transfusion jaundice to the Ministry of Health. But as we will see, reports were certainly being made from 1947, so from a very early stage. The documentation we have identified suggests that notification of post-transfusion jaundice was not always straightforward or complete. And if we could go to DHSC 014009_103, please. We have a letter from a regional transfusion officer to Dr. Maycock in the Ministry of Health, dated the 1st of December 1947, reporting a case of jaundice after a transfusion of plasma. Then if we go to the second page, the officer notes, I've been making inquiries and around the hospitals and talking to RSO, but in spite of the fact that I've told them many times that we wish to have cases of jaundice reported to us, I fear that quite a number in this area have not been reported. We then have a set of minutes of a meeting of Dr. Maycock and the regional blood transfusion officers at DHSC 013054, please. The meeting took place on the 14th of January 1948. And if we go to the bottom of the page, we can see minuted that Dr. Maycock reported that during the last 18 months or so, 78 cases of hematogenous hepatitis had been reported to the ministry, of which some 25% had died. But there was no record of the outcome of about half of the remaining cases. In view of the importance of collecting as much accurate information as possible of cases of hematogenous hepatitis, he, Dr. Maycock, had prepared a report form for completion in such cases, which was submitted and approved by the meeting, with the exception of a particular paragraph. And so we see Dr. Maycock seeking to establish a clearer reporting system. We have a copy of a report form. It's not exactly the same as what was discussed at the January 1948 meeting, but it appears to be the form that was in use by October 1949. That is at DHSC 01001111_006. On that form, we can see at points 5 and 6 a note of the primary disease or injury, in this case postpartum hemorrhage and shock, and 6, the reason for the transfusion, hemorrhage and obstetric shock. And we then see notes at the bottom of this page under point 8, records dealing with the subsequent development of jaundice and what exactly happened for the patient. And if we go back up to point 7 on the same page, we see a note which explains that 2 pints of plasma had been given. Transfusion was given in the middle of the night at the patient's home. Unfortunately, numbers of bottles were not kept in the excitement of the moment.
Just reference to the plasma there, my eyes noticed when you went to the very first document you showed us from the 1st of December 1947, that's DHSC 01409_103. Can we just go back there?
DHSC 01409_103.
And if we go over, the general impression I have gained, these are the last 5 lines, is that the officers who've been in the hospitals for some time consider the Canadian plasma has been the cause of the problem. Do we know anything about the use of plasma from Canada?
So no, that's something that we also noted as we were preparing for this presentation, and it's something that the team is looking at further.
It may have been something which originated during wartime.
Indeed.
But it would be just interesting to know a bit more about it.
Indeed, sir. I'm afraid it's not something I can assist with today,
no,
but it's certainly something that's on our radar.
Very well, thank you.
And so we don't need to go back to it, Shimik, but looking at the report form from 1949, we can see that there is a note that on this occasion batch numbers weren't recorded. And we have a similar note of the failure to record batch numbers in a separate report from Wales. If we could turn to... Sorry, just one moment. Yes. If we could have DHSC 01408_054. my apologies, sir, I've just noticed we're taking this out of chronological order. We're going back to 1944. We should have looked at it earlier. Apologies. But this is a letter that also flags up the issues around batch numbers. It's a letter from the Regional Blood Transfusion Officer to Dr. Panton of the Ministry of Health, highlighting that they were asked to see a case of delayed transfusion jaundice that day. There's then a description of the clinical details of the patient and a note that she was given both plasma and whole blood. And the point I want to note from this document is on the second page. And that is the Regional Transfusion Officer recording that unfortunately the surgeon did not record the batch number of the bottle of plasma. We have the identity of the donors. Do you want any blood from the patient? Also, is it worthwhile our trying to contact the donors? They are apt to be a bit touchy when questioned, which is something else that we will pick up during the presentation. The issues being raised about how to approach donors when jaundice has been identified.
It's obviously not the first time then that donors have been asked to help where it is thought that the blood which they gave may well be the source of a subsequent infection. Indeed.
So even in 1944, we can see that this appears to be a relatively well-established process, although we've been unable to give a more definitive date for you.
Yes, thank you.
Staying with the reporting system, and apologies, returning to the forms that were used, we have another example of a form which is helpful to see, which is from Wales, dated the 15th of August 1950, DHSC 01 3011 _ 011. You'll see it's very similar to the form we looked at just a moment ago. We can see again at point 6, the 5 and 6, the primary disease or injury and the reason for the transfusion, in this case hemorrhage and shock following a prostatectomy. We then see at point 7 the date of the transfusion, and we can see that on this form there is a record of the number for the bottle of whole blood and batch numbers for the plasma. And again, sir, you'll notice that against the plasma it says CAN, which is something else again in relation to Canada that we've noted and will explore. We can also see here the notes in brackets after the batch numbers and the whole blood numbers. Donor has not had jaundice, so that donor appears to have been identified and communicated with. But in relation to the second bottle of whole blood on the 23rd of March 1950, they've recorded donor did not reply to letter. So,
but they obviously haven't been able to make any inquiries about the Canadian plasma, if it was the Canadian plasma which was responsible.
Indeed. There's no note at all of what happened in relation to those products. And the issue of donors not necessarily responding when they're followed up by the Regional Blood Service, it is a theme that we see throughout the time frame.
Just as a matter of interest, this is 1950, is it?
It is, sir, yes.
And if the Canadian, just go back to where we were, please, Shumake. No, thank you. The date there is 28th of February 1945, so presumably that was the date when the plasma was first taken?
It's very unclear at this point, sir, and again, it's something that we've highlighted that we need to consider further.
So it would suggest, as I think there's been some reference in one of the other documents you've just been showing me, that the plasma might have been dried and reconstituted.
Indeed.
but it plainly had a long shelf life.
Indeed, yes. I think that's not something we've seen particularly before.
Well, this is, we're told that plasma had a much longer shelf life than red blood. It would last for 2 or 3 years. This is an example of it being used 5 years after, if this date is the date of taking, 5 years after it has been taken, and presumably, if it's been dried pretty quickly.
Indeed.
And it would suggest that it was wartime.
Indeed, 1945, yes, indeed. It's something, sir, that we are aware we need to look further at. If we then continue into the 1960s, we have a number of examples where reverse look-back and look-back had been mostly successful. One of those examples is from Wales in December 1964. We have a letter of December 1964, we don't need to put it up. Dr. Bevan informed Dr. Maycock that there'd been a homologous serum jaundice case, and the usual follow-up of donors had been undertaken. That was then followed up by a letter which is dated the 4th of January 1965, Dhsc 013017_002, please, Shomik. So the letter refers to the earlier letter, which had simply said that the usual follow-up of donors had been undertaken, and it was addressing 3 recent donations from the implicated donor have been traced back. One, as you know, went into post-vaccinal pool number 50, which has now been destroyed. The second was transfused at Orpington in 1962. A recent follow-up of the recipient shows no evidence of any trouble whatsoever, and certainly no jaundice. The third was transfused at Cookfield Hospital in July 1963. A report has now been received to the effect that the recipient was followed up for 12 months after transfusion, and there's no record of any jaundice resulting. Although the donor involved has reaffirmed his freedom from jaundice at any time, he's now been query implicated on 3 occasions, and he's therefore been withdrawn from the panel. And so here we have an example of a donor being identified as being problematic and the previous donations being followed through. A very similar example can be found in a report from May 1965, Dhsc 013017_027, please. This is a report, if we just look at the bottom, please, Shomik, we can see it's from the North East Metropolitan region. And then we can see in section 7 a record of the bottle numbers that had been transfused, with the plasma batch number which was not recorded. So we have the bottle numbers of the whole blood, but no record of the plasma batch that was used. We have the usual clinical notes as well as some liver function tests. And then at the bottom of the page, we have a note that's been added by the Regional Transfusion Director at the very bottom. 8 donors have been contacted and deny a history of jaundice or contact with a case. There are 8 different bottle numbers of blood that were used, so it appears that at least in relation to the blood, they had been able to contact the 8 donors in relation to the blood, but of course there was no record of the batch number of the plasma. So it's simply another example of what was being done during this period by way of both reporting homologous serum jaundice and also the tracing work that was being attempted. The inquiry has also, we've also identified evidence of ongoing difficulties in the 1960s with these exercises. Firstly, there were issues around the resource implications of doing following these processes. If we could have DHSC 013015, please. Sorry, _241, apologies. This is a letter from Dr. Drummond to Dr. Maycock. So from the Welsh region, dated the 22nd of May 1962. And in that letter, he says this: "We discussed briefly at the recent MRC meeting the matter of tracking down cases of HSJ, homologous serum jaundice. It is, I hope, a fair statement of fact that our methods have produced and are producing results in the way of cases of post-transfusion serum hepatitis. More cases could be traced, but the work has now become too great to be adequately coped with, as I hinted in a previous letter. It's worth considering what's involved in a hypothetical case which has had, for example, 7 bottles of blood and 3 of SP dried plasma of different batches. Suppose the donors of the 7 bottles of blood have, between them, donated on 30 occasions. The fate of each donation has to be accounted for. That may mean going back 10 years or more in some donors. For each donation transfused, the recipients must be contacted. We have to ascertain via the hospital, then GP, whether patient still survives. If alive, we must ascertain from the patient whether he or she had jaundice in the 6 months following transfusion. Several cases have come to light in this way. In the case of donations used for plasma, the fate of the plasma must be ascertained and recipients traced as above. Finally, in case of SP plasma, all the donors, if this region, contributing to the pools, must be accounted for and all donations they've given back traced as above. If this work is worthwhile, particularly as the machinery for a continuing survey in one region, we must have more hands for the job. As things are, this work must be cut down rather than increased." And he goes on to ask for authorisation to use what he describes as a bleeding session doctor for the work 1 day a week. Another issue that is raised in the documentation about these processes and the challenges of them relates to the issue of reports of jaundice not being made to the regional transfusion services. So if we can have DHSC 013017 _034, please. Again, this is a letter from Dr. Drummond to Dr. Maycock in July 1965, where he records, "We have felt for some years that the Cardiff RI does not notify us as many cases as it ought. I give below figures on usage of blood and plasma and cases of serum hepatitis notified to the BTS." There's then data provided in the letter whereby Dr. Drummond compares the case incidence of serum hepatitis at Cardiff RI with that of the rest of the region, or the apparent incidence in light of their reports. He says at the end that using the case incidence of the rest of the region, the expected number of cases for the Cardiff RI would be 13.6 cases, which is 0.034%, and not 9, which is 0.023%, as notified to the BTS. So the case incidence that's reported appears to be lower than that which he would expect, given the reporting across the region. He goes on, just over the page, please. I'm not sufficient of a statistician to say precisely what interpretation should be placed on these figures, but it appears to me that 9 cases of serum hepatitis is rather too few for Cardiff RI. I'd be interested in the views of the ministry statisticians. We then also have Dr. Maycock's response, DHSC 013017_047, please. Dr. Maycock responds, indicating that he hadn't been able to show the letter to a statistician, but halfway through the first paragraph, he notes, it certainly looks on the face of it that a number of cases of serum hepatitis are not being detected at the Cardiff Royal Infirmary, though I'm not sure whether the figures are large enough to make this difference significant.
And by significant, he will be meaning, presumably, statistically significant in the sense that it's used in statistics.
That would be my understanding of what he's saying, sir. He then, Dr. Maycock then refers to a journal paper relating to the incidence of jaundice in Philadelphia, and that showed an incidence of 0.05%. It's just in the midst of the second paragraph, i.e. slightly higher than that found in the Welsh region, excluding the Cardiff Royal Infirmary. However, he found an attack rate of anicteric hepatitis equivalent to 870 per 10,000 units transfused, i.e. an incidence of 8.7%, and concludes in Philadelphia General Hospital there may have been over 100 cases of anicteric hepatitis for each icteric case diagnosed. His figures are statistically significant. So the point of highlighting these 2 letters is really the issue being raised by the Cardiff Centre with Dr. Maycock that perhaps reporting from the hospital was too low and reporting was not happening in the way they expected.
So the difference is between transfusions and units transfused.
Yes.
So the reason, otherwise it just looks on the face of it, which is why I was puzzling over the wording, that exactly the same hospital in exactly the same study has produced 2 completely different results.
Yes, indeed.
And the explanation appears to be, to me at the moment, but you can tell me if I'm right or wrong as far as you can understand it. So the difference may be that that's the incidence of 0.05%, is per transfusion, and the next is per units transfused. But I don't quite understand why that should produce the results that way around, if that's right.
Indeed.
So I'm still a bit puzzled by this.
I'm still somewhat puzzled by the Philadelphia paper, But the point that is being raised, from my understanding, is that on the basis of the number of units transfused, there is at that time a broad understanding of the likely incidence of jaundice, which is what Dr. Drummond had raised in our previous letter as well, to say that's what we would expect across the region, but Cardiff's reporting appears rather low. And my reading of Dr. Maycock's letter is that he's agreeing in light of also the work done in Philadelphia. The precise figures from the Philadelphia paper are not wholly clear.
They don't yet. I'm just rowing back on what I said a moment ago. It just doesn't make. I'm not very clear what sense it makes. You need to go to the original article to see.
I think we would. The point.
But it's not worth our while doing that. It's not making that point.
Exactly.
It's a "Have you seen this letter?" this article, by the way, type of remark.
That's exactly, sir, what I would say. That the Philadelphia paper is a little peripheral to what we are drawing together for today.
Yeah.
And the point of today is that Dr. Maycock appears to be largely agreeing with Dr. Drummond that one would have expected a greater reporting of homologous serum hepatitis from the Cardiff RI.
When he says slightly higher than found in the Welsh region, it is actually half as much again.
Indeed. And one must then remember that Cardiff is lower again than the Welsh region, excluding Cardiff.
Yes.
So there does appear to be an understanding in 1965 that the reporting of hepatitis from the hospital to the regional transfusion centre is not wholly accurate.
And this is in respect, is it, of anecteric hepatitis reports, or is it in respect of jaundice?
The letter from Dr. Drummond, if it's helpful, we can have it back up, is in relation to cases of serum hepatitis.
So it's both icteric and anecteric? Because one of the documents which you were showing me earlier was talking about cases of jaundice and within 6 months. So it was looking at acute cases and not at the sort of slow burn anecteric case, which may be a more typical case of what we now know as hepatitis C.
Indeed. Unfortunately, this is something of a generalisation, sir, but the documents are not as cleanly defined as one might have wanted. Especially when one is looking at the look-back and the reverse look-back processes. There are some that look at serum hepatitis and some that look at jaundice, and others that are a mixture.
Well, they're creatures of their time.
Precisely, sir. Then if we can move on to just highlight a couple of documents from the 1960s that deal with problems arising because of record keeping. If we could have DHSC 013017_044, please. This is a letter from 1965 from the director of the the director of the MBTS Region 1 to Oxford's Regional Transfusion Centre, noting that further to your letter of the 9th of June, and going to give the reference, we have now been able to contact the above donor. The delay was due to her having changed her name on marriage. It's now Mrs. X. And it was just by coincidence that we found this out. This donor is a nurse and she's answered our questions in the following way. So there appears to have been a delay and a difficulty in tracing a donor because they had changed their name upon marriage, which one might consider to be something which happens relatively frequently. Other difficulties of record keeping are also present in the documentation we have. If we could have DHSC 01200113_017, please. It's a letter from June 1969 from the North East Metropolitan Regional Blood Transfusion Centre to Dr. Maycock, there is a report enclosed of post-transfusion jaundice, but I would just draw your attention to the last paragraph. With reference to our other donor, I'm afraid she's returned to her native Scotland. Address unknown, the search continues. So an example, and we've drawn out examples of things that we've seen across a number of documents, but an example of a donor having moved location and therefore not being able to be traced. If we move on into the 1970s, again, we have evidence of both look-back and reverse look-back being carried out. One example is DHSC 013018_172, please. It's from the South London region, dated the 21st of March 1975, so a very similar form to what we were looking at in the 1960s. And here we have at paragraph 8, or point 8 on the form, the brief clinical notes of what had happened to the patient, and above it we have a note of the bottle numbers for the blood that had been transfused at point 7. And then at point 11, there's a space for remarks. And we see there all the donors have been resampled and tested, and one of them, whose donation was given to the patient on the 21st of June 1974, has been found to be very weakly positive by radioimmunoassay by Dr. Dane. I think it's a fair assumption that this is indeed a case of post-transfusion jaundice. So this is simply one example of many of the process working and a report being provided, even in 1975, to the Department of Health. A moment ago, we noted the difficulties of resourcing being raised by, in one case in Wales. That issue reappears in 1978, February 1978. Although the minutes don't deal specifically with look back and reverse look back as being a difficulty for staffing, it's perhaps worth just noting that there were significant staffing, or there appear to have been significant staffing issues. If we could go to NHBT 0018353. These are the minutes of the Regional Transfusion Directors meeting of the 22nd of February 1978. And if we turn to internal page 7, there's a heading, medical staffing. Directors discussed staff shortages in regions and the number of times they'd advertised without result. Altogether, there were 10 vacancies, including 1 deputy directorship. There were 2 vacancies in Newcastle, Liverpool, South London and Bristol had 1 vacancy. Brentwood and Cambridge each had a vacancy but hadn't received any applications. There was 1 vacancy at Cardiff. So although this is not specific to look back, it's an issue that has been raised in relation to look back and reverse look back, and we see a broader context for that in 1978. So drawing the threads together in relation to early jaundice investigations, we've identified a reporting system was in place, but there are 4 themes that arise from the documents that I wanted to highlight today, and I hope I have done so through the documents. There were difficulties arising from clinicians not reporting all cases of post-transfusion jaundice or serum hepatitis. There were difficulties with record keeping, in particular the noting of donor numbers and batch numbers. There were problems surrounding whether donors responded to the blood services contact and with keeping up to date with the contact details of donors. And there were resourcing problems and staff shortages. So that then takes us on to hepatitis B look-back processes. I'm addressing that now because it straddles the early jaundice inquiries, but it also goes to a point beyond the hepatitis C look-back, and we'll see what I mean by that. But it's convenient to deal with it now because it ties into the early jaundice inquiries, but I expect it's something we'll come back to at a later point as well. It's simply to set some of the basic position in place. Once hepatitis B was identified, then investigations into post-transfusion hepatitis B was taking place, much as they did with post-transfusion jaundice. It really merges in the documents to exactly what was just being dealt with as post-transfusion jaundice, and then what was specifically being dealt with as hepatitis B in and of itself. Very similar issues arose in relation to those processes, as we've already identified. First of all, if I can pick up some of the documents that deal with difficulties around batch numbers, record keeping and tracing of donors. If we could have DHSC 013018_056, please. Here we have a report from Dr. Maycock to a Dr. Cuthbert, dated the 19th of September 1974, attaching 4 reports of hepatitis in patients associated with transfusion. In the first example, he notes there seems little doubt that this is a case of hepatitis B, and a donor was found on retest to be positive for hepatitis B antigen. So an example of a successful reverse look back. Then we have the 4th case. This patient clearly had hepatitis B, for which the fibrinogen may have been responsible. Unfortunately, no record of the batch number was kept. We then come into 1985 at NHBT 0115650_030. We have a letter from, Dr. Hewitt to a Charing Cross Hospital senior lecturer in haematology, dated the 26th of November 1985. Which records that in May 1984, you reported to us a case of probable post-transfusion hepatitis B in this patient. She explains what had happened and then says, in view of the high probability of post-transfusion hepatitis B in this case, we attempted to contact and resample all the involved donors. A total of 28 donors have given repeat samples and none has any marker of past hepatitis B infection. Unfortunately, we've been unable to contact the remaining 4 donors, all of whom are young males and who have not responded to letters or attended any blood donor clinics in the interim, despite requests to contact us. we're making one final effort to contact these 4 in an attempt to close this inquiry. I apologise for the long delay in sending this report to you, but unfortunately we've been unable to reach a definite conclusion. So again, once it was a more specific matter of hepatitis B rather than the general jaundice inquiries, we see ongoing difficulties of contacting donors and difficulties around batch numbers. We then come to a series of letters from 1990. In June 1989, a patient had died, and at that point, the North London Regional Transfusion Centre were notified that the patient was suffering from hepatitis B. There was then a delay of a year before BPL were notified of the infectivity of the plasma that the patient had received. For the purposes of today, we don't need to go into the detail of how that 1-year delay arose. But out of that incident, Dr. Hewitt undertook a review of post-transfusion hepatitis B reports across the period of 1986 to 1989, and it's that report that I want to go to. The document is NHBT 3030770, please. It's a report she made to Dr. Gunson. And if we pick up at the second paragraph, please. Between 1986 to 1989, there were a total of 14 reports of hepatitis B to us, which we felt were likely to be associated with blood transfusion. As you will see, we investigate 3 to 4 cases of possible, probable post-transfusion hepatitis B each year. 2 of these were felt to be due to transfusion abroad, and no recall of NLBTC donors followed. In a further 2 cases, there was no donor follow-up because the reports involved an incidental finding of hepatitis B surface antigen positivity in a multi-transfused recipient without any indication of date of seroconversion or indeed proof of a previous hepatitis B surface antigen negative status. In 8 of the remaining 10 cases, an attempt was made to contact all involved donors. The response rate was high, although not complete. In 3 cases, all resampled donors were negative for HBV markers, and in another 3, 1 resampled donor was anti-HBC positive and withdrawn as possibly implicated. 1 case was predicted by us when a donor was detected hepatitis B surface antigen positive at the next donation. The previous donation was subsequently confirmed negative. This donor was obviously in the early infectious stage of hepatitis B infection, but below the level of detection in surface antigen screening tests at the time of the implicated donation. The final case has been fully documented. This leaves 2 cases. This leaves 2 cases where the numbers of donors involved were huge and recall of all donors thought to be logistically impossible. Examination of records revealed a common donor found to be HBC positive on recall, anti-HBC positive on recall. Thus, out of 14 documented cases in 1986 to 1989, 4 not investigated for reasons given, 5 implicated donor anti-HBC positive, surface antigen negative, 3 no HBV markers identified in resampled donors and no donor implicated, 1 donor in early stage of HBV infection but surface antigen negative, and 1 donor had low level of surface antigen. This summary indicates that the checking of original surface antigen results on donors involved in PTHB inquiries is unlikely to be of help to BPL in deciding the fate of held products. Our latest report to BPL involving 183 donors and 120 plasma donations forwarded to BPL required 15 hours of senior scientific officer time to check original surface antigen results. If the checking of previous surface antigen test results is now to be part of BPL's requirements, we shall obviously require additional resources. So again, what we see in this report, which was the survey of a period of 1985 to 1989, are issues arising in relation to tracing donors and, at the end, concerns about resources and the work required to be able to do this sort of work. There are other examples of investigations into hepatitis B being delayed. If I can turn up NHBT 0023823, please, Shomik. It's a letter from February 1995, which addresses in the first paragraph that this was a jaundice inquiry that's been going on for almost 3 years now. It's explained that in this case it related to bone marrow that was stored in liquid nitrogen tank while infectious, and it was then transmitted to other patients. So it's slightly different, but the purpose of showing this document series is paragraph 2. We thought we'd solved the problem on 2 occasions, but both donors have proved to be negative on subsequent retesting. I'm writing to you now because Richard Tedder asked me to go through with a fine-tooth comb all our non-attending donors, and I'm ashamed to say that I now see what I should have seen before, that 4 of those donors live in South London, and so contact was being made. And if we just go over the page, sorry, one further page. We can see just an apology at the end. I'm really sorry these donor addresses hadn't clicked with me earlier. My only excuse is we've closed and reopened this inquiry on at least 3 occasions as new evidence has come to light, not to mention new lists of donation numbers from UCH. However, I've now written it into my procedure that I must check the addresses of lapsed donors in case they're attending you or Collindale. So the point really of picking up this document is simply the fact that some inquiries took a number of years to complete, and there were, again, difficulties of identifying donors and donor addresses in order to be able to complete those processes. A further example of that, even into 1993, NHBT 2010671. It's a letter from a Dr. Herborn, a consultant haematologist, to Dr. Gunson about a donor who's probably caused post-transfusion hepatitis B. Thank you for your advice concerning this donor. As I mentioned on the telephone, he's now linked with 2 cases of post-transfusion hepatitis B. His tests for hepatitis B surface antigen have always been negative, but he has anti-HBC. Unfortunately, we ran out of serum and couldn't test him for anti-HBS. I wrote to him 3 times, and the 3rd letter has been returned by the post office marked not at this address. He's not registered with a GP, and there doesn't seem to be any way we can contact him. I wrote to a doctor in each of the UK transfusion centres. So again, a further example in 1993 of difficulties of contacting donors and identifying where they were. In 1995, a study into the incidence of hepatitis B in the donor population was undertaken. The purpose of the study was said to be to assess the transmissibility of hepatitis B in blood donations negative for hepatitis B surface antigen, but positive for antibody to hepatitis B core. The study was planned so that it took place after the hepatitis C look back. So we are a little further on in time. The study went ahead after the look back, the hepatitis C look back, but it's clear that the look back exercise that then followed wasn't straightforward, partly because of difficulties with accessing medical records. And I just want to go through a few documents dealing with this particular study. If we could turn to NHBT 2012414, please. And if we can go to page 3 to start with, please. We have a letter from August 1996 from a consultant haematologist to Dr. Hewitt about the hepatitis B look-back study, and it records this. A small start. These are the 4-unit number pro formas for those blood components sent to the Atkinson Morley's Hospital. The blood bank at AMH was closed down 2.5 years ago. We can trace 3 of the units, but 1 has sunk without trace. No record exists of its fate, either in the AMH records or our own at St George's. Blood was transferred down here after 2 weeks at AMH, and you resupplied AMH with newer units. I'm returning all 4 report forms. The St George's reports will take some time to come through. There are 82 of them, and all the old record books have to be gone through to pick them up. It's laborious. To which Dr. Hewitt replied, it's the second page of this document, please. Thank you very much for the forms. Please could you bear in mind that we can offer help going through old record books if your laboratory staff would feel that an additional person would indeed be a help and not a hindrance. The majority of hospitals are able to complete this task quite easily because the records are on computer. If this is not the case at St George's, then we would do everything possible to lighten the load on your staff. And they were expecting to employ a student who might be used for it. So again, we see in 1996 in the hepatitis B look-back study, difficulties being raised in relation to medical records at the hospital level for exactly what had happened to blood components. We then continue to NHBT 2030267_002, please. We have a report form around red cells that had been issued to Lewisham, and we can see handwritten on this very first page, untraceable. And if we turn the page, we can see at the top that there are records available to identify receipt of the component and the fate of the component, that it was transfused to a patient. But if we go to point 5, we can see that in relation to the patient's surname and forename, it's simply written unknown male, and then a note on the side, patient transferred to another hospital from A&E. So again, another example of the limited information that was being identified in relation to some recipients. And it's perhaps helpful to look at a draft report of the study from October 1996, NHBT 307899, please. It's an update that was given to the MSBT at 10th meeting. So it's an update on the study as at the 14th of October 1996. And the key part of it for our purposes today is part 2, recipient tracing, where we can see the number of components in relation. The first column is in relation to South Thames. The second column is in relation to East Anglia. And we can work our way through identifying the number of components in South Thames was 1,122. And at that stage, information was awaited on the fate of 576 components. Information that was awaited on patients was 403 in South Thames, whereas in East Anglia there was just 204 components, of which 4 the fate of the component was awaited, and nothing was awaited in relation to particular patients. But the other figure to note, of course, is also the no notes available. There were 3 components in East Anglia where no notes were available. And it simply gives an indicator of some of the successes and difficulties of the recipient tracing. The final document in relation to hepatitis B that I want to go to today is NHBT 0016619, please. It's a letter from 2009 from Dr. Hewitt dealing with a notification that had been given about a patient with acute hepatitis B diagnosed in December 2008. The second paragraph records that we, NHSBT, we forwarded to you a notification form on the 9th of February 2009 requesting details about the infected patient, the test results and a copy of the transfusion laboratory record for the patient in question. To date, I've not received any of this information. According to the email, the patient had undergone cardiac surgery and an orthopaedic procedure. They'd received 2 units of blood products on each occasion, and the donation numbers were quoted. Whilst awaiting the further information, we identified the 4 donations listed in the email and established that all 4 donors had reattended at least once since the donation transfused to patient X in the summer of 2008. The archived samples from all 4 subsequent donations were retrieved and tested for the presence of anti-HBC. All 4 samples were anti-HBC negative. These results exclude any of the donors as having been infected with hepatitis B. The 4 blood donations listed in the doctor's email cannot therefore be implicated as a source of hepatitis B infection in patient X. I would stress that we've not received the minimum information necessary in order to document the details of this case. In particular, donation numbers have been provided in an email and not from a computer laboratory printout. We therefore can't vouch for the accuracy of the donation numbers provided to us. If you could now provide the information requested, we can include it in the file and confirm that the correct donations have been investigated. Otherwise, I'm now closing our investigation with the conclusion that patient X's hepatitis B infection was not due to the transfusion of the 4 units of blood products notified to us in the doctor's email. We've assumed that the blood products in question were red cells. As a final document in 2009, it's simply to note that, again, the difficulties of that communication between the hospital and the blood services. So I'm about to move on to HTLV3 look back, but I note the time. I'm happy to start and then break, or whatever you would prefer.
Well, let's take a break now and have it all in one go. So we'll come back, shall we, at 25 to 4. 25 to 4.